In the remote Pacific Northwest wilderness, a mountain hermit's peaceful morning shattered when her German shepherd alerted her to a massive golden eagle. The bird deliberately dropped a GPS tracker at her feet, the same technology from the wildlife trafficking ring she'd helped destroy 3 years ago. Gena Jenkins wasn't just hiding from her past. For 15 years, she'd been a renowned wildlife biologist whose federal testimony had dismantled an international criminal empire and forced her into witness protection. What began as isolation would become survival. One woman's expertise was about to collide with a vengeful trafficker's 3-year hunt for revenge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the peaks like a shroud, filtering the early sunlight into pale gold streams that barely penetrated the canopy above Gena Jenkins's isolated cabin. 3 years of mountain mornings had established a rhythm as predictable as the seasons themselves. Wake before dawn, coffee from yesterday's grounds. Check the solar battery levels. Feed Atlas. Begin the daily inventory of her small, carefully curated world. Atlas padded beside her as she made her rounds, his graying muzzle testament to their shared journey from her former life to this one. The German shepherd's limp was barely noticeable now. The injury that had ended his search and rescue career had healed cleanly, though it still stiffened in cold weather. Gena's fingers found the familiar ridge of scar tissue behind his left ear as they paused at the rain gauge. 12 millimeters overnight. Enough to top off the cistern, but not enough to worry about erosion on the trail down to the cache site. "Good boy," she murmured, the words automatic after 3 years of one-sided conversations. Atlas tilted his head, amber eyes alert but patient. He understood the routine as well as she did. Morning rounds, equipment check, radio silence maintained. The outside world held at bay for another day, but this morning something was different. Atlas's ears pricked forward, a subtle shift in his posture that Gena had learned to read like a textbook. Not the casual alertness of a deer moving through the underbrush or the focused attention of a hawk hunting field mice. This was something else entirely. His muscles coiled with tension she hadn't seen since their first winter here, when a black bear had wandered too close to the cabin. "What is it, boy?" The sound reached her then, a wild, piercing cry that seemed to echo off the mountain walls. Golden eagles weren't uncommon in this region, but this call carried an urgency that made her skin prickle. Atlas whined softly, pressing closer to her leg as the cry came again, closer now. Gena shielded her eyes against the morning glare and scanned the sky. There, circling perhaps 200 feet above the cabin, wings spread in a pattern she knew by heart. The distinctive silhouette of a mature golden eagle, riding the thermals with practiced ease. But something about its flight pattern seemed wrong. Too tight, too focused. Eagles didn't typically circle like this unless they were protecting territory or hunting specific prey. "Easy, Atlas," but her own voice carried tension now. In her former life, she would have had binoculars, radio telemetry equipment, field notebooks filled with behavioral observations. Here, she had only her eyes and 3 years of trying to forget everything she once knew about wildlife behavior. The eagle's cries grew more insistent. Atlas began to pace, his nails clicking against the wooden deck planks. Gena found herself stepping backward toward the cabin door, every instinct screaming that something was profoundly wrong with this scenario. The eagle dropped lower. 3 years ago, Dr. Gena Jenkins would have been fascinated by this behavior, would have reached for her camera, started documenting flight patterns and vocalizations, would have recognized the opportunity to observe apex predator behavior at close range. But that woman had died in a federal courthouse in Seattle, her testimony sealing the fate of an international wildlife trafficking ring, and her own. The eagle circled lower still, and Gena caught a glimpse of something that made her blood freeze. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible even to herself. "No, no, no." The bird landed on the railing of her deck with the confidence of a creature that had never learned to fear humans. This close, Gena could see every detail of its magnificent plumage, the fierce intelligence in its dark eyes, the powerful grip of talons designed to crush the life from prey. And clutched in those talons, like some impossible nightmare made real, was a small, waterproof device she recognized instantly. A GPS tracker, the same model she had testified about in federal court. The same technology that had allowed her to trace the movements of trafficked raptors across 3 states. The same evidence that had sent Viktor Kozlov to federal prison and put a price on her head. Atlas's growl was low and threatening, but the eagle seemed unconcerned. It studied Gena with the kind of predatory focus that made her feel like prey. Then, with deliberate precision, it opened its talons and dropped the tracker onto the deck. The device landed with a small metallic click that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the mountain silence. Memory crashed over her like a landslide. The courtroom in Seattle, fluorescent lights harsh against polished wood. The federal prosecutor's steady voice as he walked the jury through Exhibits A through Z, her own testimony, clinical and precise, explaining how GPS trackers had revealed the trafficking network's scope. Viktor Kozlov's cold eyes, watching her from the defendant's table, promising retribution without saying a word. "Dr. Jenkins," the prosecutor had said, "in your expert opinion, could this tracking technology be used to monitor the movements of trafficked wildlife across international borders?" "Absolutely," she had replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "These devices can store months of location data, transmit real-time coordinates, and remain functional even in extreme weather conditions. They're invaluable for conservation research, but in the wrong hands." The wrong hands, Viktor Kozlov's hands specifically. Hands that had orchestrated the capture and transport of endangered species across 3 continents. Hands that had signed her death warrant the moment she agreed to testify. The eagle spread its wings, preparing for flight. For a moment, its eyes met hers directly, and Gena felt an absurd certainty that this encounter was no accident. That somewhere, somehow, she was being watched, being tested, being drawn back into a world she had sacrificed everything to escape. Then the bird was airborne, wings catching the morning light as it spiraled upward and disappeared beyond the tree line. Gena stared at the tracker lying on her deck. Such a small thing to carry such enormous implications. The device was no bigger than a matchbox, its black plastic housing designed to withstand the rigors of being attached to a wild animal. But to her it might as well have been a bomb. Atlas whined again, pressing his warm bulk against her leg. His presence anchored her, pulled her back from the edge of panic that threatened to consume her entirely. This was why she had adopted him during those final weeks before disappearing into witness protection. Not just for companionship, but for this, the steady reminder that she was still alive, still present, still capable of rational thought even when her past came calling. She knelt slowly and picked up the device, its weight familiar and terrible in her palm. The housing showed signs of wear but no obvious damage. If it was still functional, it would contain a treasure trove of data. Migration patterns, location histories, possibly even communication logs. Everything she would need to understand whatever new horror Viktor Kozlov had unleashed on the wildlife she had once sworn to protect. Everything she would need to destroy herself all over again. "We have a choice to make, boy," she said quietly, scratching behind Atlas's ears. His tail wagged once, a gesture of trust that made her chest tighten with emotion. "We can pretend this never happened. Destroy this thing and go back to our quiet life." But even as she said the words, she knew they rang false. The eagle hadn't found her by accident. Someone somewhere had wanted her to see this, to know that the work she had thought finished was starting all over again, that creatures she had dedicated her life to protecting were once again being exploited for profit. The tracker seemed to grow heavier in her hand. Inside her cabin, powered by solar batteries and carefully shielded from electronic detection, sat a laptop computer. The same machine she used for weather monitoring and equipment diagnostics could easily interface with this device, could reveal whatever secrets it carried, could destroy the carefully constructed peace she had built in these mountains. could save lives she was uniquely qualified to protect. Gena closed her eyes and listened to the mountain silence. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed against dead bark. A squirrel chattered warnings from the safety of the canopy. Atlas breathed steadily beside her, waiting for her decision with the infinite patience of a creature who trusted her completely. When she opened her eyes, her choice was made, not because it was safe or smart or even remotely rational, but because 3 years of hiding had not erased the part of her that was, at her core, a protector of wild things. The tracker would keep its secrets for now, but not for long. Gena's hand trembled slightly as she turned the GPS tracker over in her palm. The morning sun had climbed higher now, burning off the mist and casting sharp shadows across the cabin's weathered deck. Atlas sat at attention beside her, his eyes tracking her movements with the focus of a creature bred to read human intent. 3 years of deliberate disconnection, 3 years of choosing survival over purpose. And now this small device threatened to unravel everything she'd built. She could throw it into the ravine, watch it disappear into the undergrowth where no one would ever find it, return to her carefully measured existence of weather monitoring and equipment maintenance, and the kind of profound solitude that kept nightmares at bay. But her fingers wouldn't release the tracker. "This is a mistake," she said aloud, more to herself than to Atlas. The dog's ears swiveled forward, catching the uncertainty in her voice. "We should destroy it. Forget this ever happened." Even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were lies. You didn't spend 15 years studying wildlife behavior without developing certain instincts. And every instinct she possessed screamed that this tracker represented something larger than coincidence. An eagle didn't just happen to drop evidence at the doorstep of the one person in the Pacific Northwest qualified to interpret it. Gena pushed through the cabin door, Atlas padding close behind. The interior was sparse but functional. A cot in one corner, a small wood stove for heat, shelves lined with preserved foods and emergency supplies. And in the corner, farthest from the windows, carefully positioned to avoid accidental electronic detection, her laptop computer. She hadn't used it for anything beyond basic weather tracking in months. The machine represented too many memories, too many connections to a life she'd left behind. But now she found herself pulling it from its protective case, her hands moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 research sessions. "Last chance to walk away," she whispered. Atlas settled beside her chair, his warm presence a steady anchor against the rising tide of her anxiety. The tracker's data port was standard issue. She'd interfaced with hundreds of these devices during her career, downloading migration patterns and behavioral data that had revolutionized raptor conservation efforts. Before that knowledge had been weaponized, before she discovered that her research partner had been selling their findings to the highest bidder, the memory hit with physical force. Dr. James Chen, brilliant and charismatic, presenting their joint research at conferences while secretly providing traffickers with the exact information needed to intercept endangered species during migration. How long had he been betraying her? How many birds had suffered because she'd been too trusting, too focused on the science to see the corruption happening right beside her? Her fingers paused over the keyboard. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen, waiting for her command. One click would begin the data transfer. One click would open a door she might never be able to close again. She clicked. The progress bar crept across the screen with agonizing slowness. Gena forced herself to breathe steadily, counting inhales and exhales the way the bureau psychologist had taught her during those nightmare weeks after the trial. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, a combat breathing technique designed to prevent panic attacks. It wasn't working. The data began populating on her screen in familiar formats: GPS coordinates, timestamps, movement patterns. She recognized the structure immediately. It was identical to the tracking systems she'd helped develop during her doctoral research, the same systems that had been perverted into tools for exploitation. Her scientific training kicked in automatically, overriding emotion with analysis. The tracker had been active for approximately 6 months. Attached to what the data suggested was a mature golden eagle based on flight patterns and altitude ranges. The bird's movements traced a path across the Pacific Northwest, following traditional migration corridors that any wildlife biologist would recognize. But there were anomalies. Sudden stops in areas with no obvious food sources or nesting sites. Clusters of location data that suggested the bird had been confined to a small space for hours at a time. And most disturbing, the movement patterns of multiple other tracked birds that intersected with this one at regular intervals. "They're herding them," Gena breathed, her fingers flying across the keyboard to pull up comparative data. Just like before, using the migration routes to consolidate captures. Atlas whined softly, responding to the tension in her voice. She reached down absently to scratch behind his ears, her eyes never leaving the screen. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Individual birds captured during migration, held at temporary staging sites, then moved in coordinated groups toward a central collection point. The same methodology Viktor Kozlov had perfected before his arrest. The same system she had helped dismantle with her testimony. Another memory surfaced, unbidden. The courtroom in Seattle, packed with observers and media representatives. The federal prosecutor had been methodical, walking her through each piece of evidence with surgical precision. "Dr. Jenkins, can you explain to the jury what these movement patterns indicate?" She had pointed to the projected data with a laser pointer, her voice steady despite the weight of Kozlov's stare. "These anomalies suggest the birds were being captured and held at specific locations before transport. The clustering of multiple tracked individuals at the same coordinates indicates a coordinated operation, not natural behavior." "And in your professional opinion, what was the purpose of this operation?" "Wildlife trafficking," she had replied, each word feeling like a nail in her own coffin. "Specifically, the capture and sale of endangered raptor species to private collectors and illegal exotic animal markets." Kozlov had smiled then. Not a warm smile, but the cold expression of a predator acknowledging a worthy opponent. She had understood in that moment that her testimony would change everything, that there was no going back to the life she'd known. The laptop beeped, pulling her back to the present. The data transfer was complete, but now the screen displayed something new. Encrypted communication logs, embedded in the tracker's memory alongside the movement data. Someone had been using these devices not just to track birds, but to coordinate operations. Gena's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She had basic decryption skills, enough to handle standard research data security. But this was military-grade encryption, far beyond her capabilities. Attempting to break it would likely trigger security protocols, possibly alerting whoever had deployed these trackers, possibly revealing her location. She pushed back from the desk, suddenly aware that she'd been holding her breath. The cabin felt smaller now, its walls no longer a protective barrier, but a cage. How long did she have before they realized the Eagle had succeeded in its mission? How long before they came for her? "We're out of our depth, boy," she said quietly to Atlas. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, a gesture of absolute trust that made her chest ache. He didn't understand the danger, didn't comprehend that her decision to examine this data might have just condemned them both. But there was something else in the data, something that made her pull the laptop close again, despite her fear. The scale of this operation dwarfed anything Kozlov had attempted before his arrest. Dozens of birds tracked across multiple states, movement patterns suggesting an organization with resources and sophistication that went beyond simple wildlife trafficking. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power, about sending a message, about finding her. Gena scrolled through the data again, forcing herself to think like the scientist she'd once been, rather than the frightened woman she'd become. If she could decrypt those communication logs, she might understand the operation's full scope, might identify the people involved, might even find a way to stop them before more birds were captured, might destroy herself in the process. The choice crystallized with painful clarity. She could bury this tracker in the woods, destroy her laptop, disappear even deeper into the wilderness, preserve her safety at the cost of everything she'd once stood for. Or she could reach out to the one person who might be able to help decrypt this data, the one person who knew where she was and had the resources to act on this information. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus Rivera, her former handler in witness protection, the federal marshal who had tried so hard to convince her to accept relocation rather than self-imposed exile. The man who represented everything she'd been running from for 3 years. Gena's hand moved to the satellite phone she kept for absolute emergencies, then froze. Making that call would mean admitting she couldn't handle this alone. Would mean trusting the system that had failed to protect other witnesses. Would mean accepting that her isolation had been an illusion, and that some responsibilities transcended personal safety. Outside, a raven called from the tree line. Atlas's ears perked, but he remained steady beside her chair, waiting, trusting her to make the right choice. The satellite phone felt heavier than the GPS tracker had, heavier than all 3 years of self-imposed exile, heavy with the weight of consequences she couldn't yet imagine but knew would be devastating. Her finger found the power button. The screen glowed to life, displaying a single saved contact. One connection to the world she'd left behind, one chance to do what she'd always done best. Protect creatures that couldn't protect themselves, even if it meant sacrificing everything she'd built to stay safe. The satellite phone's screen dimmed after 2 rings, and Gena's finger hovered over the end call button. Maybe he wouldn't answer. Maybe after 3 years of silence, Marcus Rivera had finally given up on checking in on the witness who'd refused his help. Then his voice crackled through the speaker, familiar and instantly alert despite the early hour. This number doesn't exist, which means either you're in trouble or you're about to be. Gena's throat tightened. She hadn't heard another human voice in 6 months, since her last supply run to the trading post 40 miles down the mountain. The sound of Marcus's concern, still present after all this time, threatened to crack the careful wall she'd built around herself. "It's me," she managed. The pause on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. She counted them, her training in behavioral observation never quite dormant. 3 seconds for recognition, assessment, and the decision about how to respond to a ghost. Gena. Not a question. Not surprise. Just her name, spoken with the kind of relief that made her eyes burn. "Tell me you're calling because you finally came to your senses about that mountain. I need your help." The words came out harder than she'd intended, sharp-edged with 3 years of practiced self-sufficiency. "Something's happened. Are you compromised?" The marshal's tone shifted immediately, all business now. She heard movement in the background, the rustle of clothing, the metallic click of a weapon being checked. Marcus Rivera preparing for the worst, because that's what 15 years in witness protection taught you. The worst was always possible. Not directly. Not yet. Gena glanced at the laptop screen, at the GPS data that had upended her carefully maintained isolation. Atlas shifted beside her chair, picking up on her tension. "But I found something. Something that connects to Kozlov." The silence this time stretched longer. She heard Marcus breathing, could picture him in whatever safe house or hotel room he was using, running through contingencies and threat assessments at lightning speed. "I'm in Portland," he said finally. 3 hours out if I push it. Don't tell me anything else over this line, even encrypted." And Gena, his voice softened slightly. "Don't run. I know that's your instinct, but running right now might be the worst thing you could do." The call ended before she could respond. Gena stared at the phone, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. Relief that she wouldn't face this alone. Resentment that she'd needed to ask for help at all. Fear that involving Marcus would destroy the last shreds of the peace she'd fought so hard to maintain. 3 hours, she said to Atlas. The dog's ears perked forward. "We could be gone in 30 minutes, deeper into the mountains where even Marcus couldn't find us." But even as she said it, her eyes drifted back to the laptop screen, to the patterns of raptor movements that told a story of systematic exploitation, to evidence of an operation that dwarfed anything she'd seen before. to the encrypted communications that might hold the key to understanding how Viktor Kozlov was rebuilding his empire from inside a federal prison. Or outside one. The thought hit her like ice water. What if Kozlov was no longer incarcerated? What if the past 3 years of her isolation had been built on the false assumption that prison walls would hold a man with his resources and connections? Gena pulled up a browser window, her fingers shaking slightly as she navigated to the Federal Bureau of Prisons inmate locator. The system was public-facing, designed to let families track their incarcerated loved ones. She'd checked it obsessively during her first year in hiding, watching Kozlov's location update at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute. She hadn't checked in 18 months. The search field blinked at her, cursor waiting. She typed slowly, Kozlov, Viktor, registration number 24887-025. The results loaded with cruel efficiency. Released. Date, 14 months ago. Reason, sentence. Completion with time served. The cabin tilted around her. Or maybe she was the one tilting. The world suddenly rendered in sharp angles that didn't make sense. 14 months. Kozlov had been free for 14 months, while she'd convinced herself that distance and isolation could keep her safe. No, the word came out strangled. Atlas pressed against her leg, his warmth a reminder to breathe. No, that's not possible. He had 15 years. How did he? But she knew how. Appeals, plea agreements, the Byzantine machinery of the federal justice system that could reduce sentences for cooperation or technicalities or any of a dozen other reasons that made perfect sense to lawyers and none at all to the witnesses who'd risked everything to testify. Her hands moved automatically, pulling up news archives, searching for any mention of Kozlov's release. She found a brief article from a legal blog, dry and factual. Early release granted due to cooperation with federal authorities on unrelated trafficking cases. Model prisoner. No indication of continued threat. No indication, Gena muttered bitterly, because men like Viktor Kozlov broadcast their intentions through press releases. The GPS tracker on her desk seemed to pulse with new significance. Not just evidence of a new trafficking operation. Bait, a carefully crafted lure designed to do exactly what it had done, draw her out of hiding, force her to make contact, create digital footprints that could be traced. She should have destroyed it immediately, should have trusted her first instinct and thrown it into the ravine. But hindsight was worthless currency when you were already compromised. The sound of an engine cut through her spiraling thoughts. Too soon for Marcus. He couldn't have made 3 hours and 45 minutes, even pushing hard. Atlas was on his feet immediately, a low growl building in his chest that raised every hair on Gena's arms. She moved to the window, staying to the side where she couldn't be seen from outside. A dark SUV was navigating the rough trail to her cabin, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Gena's hand found the hunting rifle she kept mounted above the door. Not her first choice for home defense, but it was what she had, what she'd allowed herself to keep when she'd walked away from everything else. The SUV stopped 50 yards out just beyond the clearing, far enough to avoid seeming threatening, close enough that she could see the driver's door open. Marcus Rivera stepped out, hands visible and empty, moving with the careful precision of someone approaching a spooked animal. He was older than she remembered, more gray in his dark hair, new lines around his eyes. But his bearing was the same, that marshal's blend of authority and watchfulness that never quite disappeared, even in civilian clothes. Gena. His voice carried across the distance, calm and measured. I'm alone. No backup, no surveillance, just me. You made 3 hours in 45 minutes. She didn't move from the window, didn't lower the rifle. I lied about Portland. He took 2 careful steps forward, stopping when Atlas's growl intensified. I've been in the area for the past week. There's been chatter, activity suggesting Kozlov's organization is operating in the Pacific Northwest again. You've been watching me. Not a question. An accusation that tasted like betrayal, even though she'd known, on some level, that Marcus would never truly let her disappear. Watching over you, he corrected gently. There's a difference. Can I come closer? We need to talk, and I'd rather not do it shouting across your yard. Gena's finger rested on the rifle's trigger guard, not quite committed, but not quite safe either. Every instinct she'd honed over 3 years of isolation screamed at her to send him away, to maintain her boundaries and her carefully constructed solitude. But the GPS tracker on her desk told a different story. Told her that isolation had been an illusion and that whatever was coming had already found her. "Atlas, stand down!" The command came out rough, but the dog obeyed immediately, his growls subsiding to wary alertness. Gena lowered the rifle but kept it in her hands as she stepped onto the deck. "You have 5 minutes. Then you leave and don't come back." Marcus nodded, accepting the terms, even though they both knew they were meaningless. He climbed the steps to her deck with careful movements, his eyes taking in everything, her defensive posture, Atlas's continued vigilance. The changes 3 years of mountain living had carved into her appearance. "You look good," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "Healthy, strong, this life suits you better than I expected. 4 minutes. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. Viktor Kozlov was released 14 months ago. Since then, we've documented activity suggesting he's rebuilding his trafficking network, but with modifications. More sophisticated, more distributed, harder to trace. I know." Gena gestured toward the cabin door. "Come inside. You need to see what I found." Marcus stood in the center of Gena's cabin, his marshal's eyes cataloging every detail with the kind of professional assessment that made her simultaneously grateful and resentful. He'd respected her 5-minute boundary by ignoring it completely, and she'd let him because they both understood that some thresholds once crossed couldn't be uncrossed. The laptop screen glowed between them, GPS data painting a damning picture across the Pacific Northwest. Marcus leaned closer, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the implications. Atlas had settled near the door, watching the federal marshal with wary acceptance. "This is active." Marcus's finger traced one of the migration patterns without touching the screen. "Current operations?" Last data point was 3 days ago. Gena pulled up the detailed timeline. Multiple birds, coordinated movements, staging areas that match Kozlov's old methodology. But there's something else. She opened the encrypted communication logs, watching Marcus's expression shift from concern to something darker. "Military-grade encryption," he said quietly. "This isn't just wildlife trafficking anymore. Someone's using these operations as cover for something bigger, or someone's very serious about not being caught again." Gena crossed her arms, feeling the chill of the cabin despite the morning sun streaming through the windows. "Either way, I can't decrypt it. That's why I called you." Marcus pulled out his phone, photographing the screen from multiple angles. "I'll need to send this to our tech division. They can—" The sound of an engine cut him off. Different from Marcus's SUV, higher pitched, struggling with the rough terrain. Both of them moved to the window instinctively, Marcus's hand drifting toward his concealed weapon. A battered Subaru emerged from the tree line, listing slightly to one side as it navigated the rutted path. The driver was visible through the windshield, young, female, dark hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail. And even from this distance, Gena could see the blood on her face. "You expecting company?" Marcus was already moving toward the door, his body language shifting into protective mode. "No one knows I'm here, except you." Gena grabbed the rifle again, but something about the woman's desperate maneuvering made her hesitate. This wasn't an attack. This was someone running. The Subaru stopped abruptly 20 yards from the cabin, one tire clearly damaged. The door opened, and the woman half fell out, catching herself against the vehicle's frame. She was young, mid-20s maybe, wearing field clothes that had seen better days. A camera hung around her neck, and her backpack looked like it had been slashed open, contents spilling onto the ground. "Please," the woman called out, her voice hoarse. "I need help. They destroyed everything. My equipment, my research." She stumbled, and Gena was moving before she'd made a conscious decision, Marcus close behind her. Up close, the damage was worse. The woman had a gash above her left eyebrow, and her hands were scraped raw. But it was her eyes that caught Gena's attention, the particular combination of fear and determination that she recognized from a mirror 3 years ago. "Inside," Gena said, supporting the woman's weight as they climbed the deck steps. "Marcus, get the first aid kit from under the sink." The woman looked between them with confusion and hope warring on her face. "You're the mountain hermit. The one Tommy Yazzie told me about. He said if I was in real trouble I should find you." Gena's hands stilled for a fraction of a second at the mention of Tommy's name. The guide who discovered her secret during her first winter and kept it faithfully ever since. If he'd sent someone here, the situation was serious. "What's your name?" She guided the woman to the single chair, Marcus already returning with the medical supplies. "Dr. Elena Vasquez." The young woman winced as Gena began cleaning the head wound. "Wildlife biologist. I've been documenting raptor populations in the region for the past 6 months. 3 days ago, someone ransacked my research station, destroyed my equipment, left a message telling me to leave the area, or next time it wouldn't just be my gear." The timeline clicked into place with sickening clarity. 3 days ago, the same time as the last GPS data point, Gena caught Marcus's eye and saw her own realization reflected there. "What were you researching specifically?" Marcus kept his tone casual, but Gena heard the interrogator beneath the concerned stranger. Elena looked up at him, seeming to really register his presence for the first time. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You're federal. I can tell by the way you stand." She turned back to Gena. "Is this a setup? Did Tommy—" "Tommy didn't set you up," Gena interrupted gently. "And yes, he's federal. My former witness protection handler, actually. You just happened to arrive at a very complicated moment." The young woman's eyes widened. "Witness protection? From what?" Gena applied butterfly bandages to the head wound, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt internally. "Tell me about your research first. What exactly were you documenting?" Elena pulled a waterproof data card from her pocket, one of the few things that seemed to have survived intact. "Golden eagles, primarily. I've been tracking migration patterns, nesting behaviors, population dynamics. But over the past 2 months, I've noticed anomalies. Birds disappearing from established territories. Changes in movement patterns that don't align with natural behavior." She handed the card to Gena and their eyes met. Something passed between them, recognition of a shared passion, a shared expertise. This young woman was doing exactly what Gena had once done, with the same naive belief that science and documentation could protect the natural world. "You noticed the birds were being captured," Gena said quietly. Elena's breath caught. "How did you know?" "I only confirmed it last week when I found one of the staging areas. There were cages hidden under camouflage netting, sophisticated equipment and—" She paused, her voice dropping. "GPS trackers, the same ones I'd seen in research papers about wildlife trafficking networks." Marcus moved closer, his interest sharpening. "Did you document the site?" "Everything. Photos, video, GPS coordinates. It's all on that card." Elena's hands shook slightly as she gestured to the data card now in Gena's possession. "That's why they came after me. They know I have evidence." Gena inserted the card into her laptop, pulling up Elena's meticulously organized files. The young woman's research was impressive. Detailed behavioral observations, population surveys, migration tracking. And then, in a folder dated 1 week ago, photographs of exactly what she'd described: cages, equipment, and in one image, clearly visible, a GPS tracker identical to the one currently sitting on Gena's desk. "You're Dr. Gena Jenkins." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "Oh my God, you're actually Dr. Gena Jenkins." Gena's hands froze over the keyboard. She hadn't heard her full name spoken aloud in 3 years. The sound of it felt like a physical blow. "I studied your work in graduate school," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength despite her injuries. "Your research on raptor trafficking patterns revolutionized conservation enforcement. You were my inspiration for going into field biology. Everyone said you died or disappeared after the Kozlov trial, but I never believed—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes darting to Marcus, then back to Gena. "Kozlov, the trafficking ring, these are his people, aren't they?" The cabin fell silent, except for Atlas's steady breathing. Gena looked at the young woman in front of her, passionate, brilliant, and in danger because she'd followed the same path that had destroyed Gena's life. Because she'd believed, as Gena once had, that exposing the truth would be enough to stop it. "Yes," Gena said finally, "these are his people, and you're in more danger than you realize." Elena straightened in the chair despite her injuries, her jaw setting with familiar determination. "Then we need to stop them. We have evidence now. Between your tracker data and my documentation, we can—" "You can get yourself killed," Marcus interrupted, his voice hard. "This isn't an academic exercise. These people have already murdered 2 witnesses from the original trial. They won't hesitate to add you to that list." But Elena wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on Gena's laptop screen, on the GPS data that told its own damning story. "This is bigger than the original operation. Look at the distribution patterns. They're not just targeting local populations anymore. This is coordinated across multiple states, maybe multiple countries." Gena's scientific mind kicked into gear, despite her better judgment, pulling up comparative maps. Elena was right. The scope had expanded exponentially. What Kozlov had built before was crude compared to this, a sophisticated network that used legitimate conservation technology and natural migration patterns as cover. "Your research," Gena said slowly. "Show me everything you have on population dynamics, especially any birds you documented that then disappeared." For the next 20 minutes, they worked in tandem, 2 biologists speaking the shared language of data analysis and field observation. Marcus watched from near the door, his expression growing grimmer as the picture emerged. 15 confirmed disappearances in Elena's study area alone. Migration patterns that had been artificially disrupted. And most damning, evidence that the traffickers were using tribal lands as staging areas, knowing that federal jurisdiction complications would slow any investigation. "This is my fault," Elena said quietly, staring at the screen. "I thought I was being careful. I thought documenting everything would keep me safe. But I led them straight to—" "No!" Gena's voice was sharp. "This is not your fault. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You're a scientist. You documented a crime. The fault lies with the criminals, not with you." Elena looked up at her with eyes that held too much understanding. "Is that what you tell yourself? After 3 years hiding in the mountains?" The words hit harder than they should have because they were true. The silence that followed Elena's challenge stretched thin and dangerous. Gena felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, the truth of the young woman's words cutting deeper than any physical wound. 3 years of telling herself that survival was enough. That isolation was a form of protection rather than abandonment. Marcus shifted near the door, breaking the tension. "We need to move this conversation forward. Standing around debating past choices won't help when Kozlov's people are actively—" A soft knock on the cabin door stopped him mid-sentence. 3 measured taps, followed by 2 more, a pattern Gena recognized immediately. Atlas rose to his feet but didn't growl. He knew that knock too. "It's Tommy," Gena said, moving past Marcus to open the door. He wouldn't come unless it was urgent. Tommy Yazzie stood on the deck, his weathered face unreadable in the morning light. He was dressed for the trail, hiking boots worn smooth, a pack that spoke of someone who knew how to move through wilderness efficiently. His dark eyes took in the scene, Marcus's defensive posture, Elena's injuries, the tension crackling through the cabin. "I see my directions were followed," he said to Elena, his voice carrying the measured calm of someone who chose words carefully. Then to Gena, "We need to talk, all of us. There are men in the mountains asking questions." "How many?" Marcus's hand drifted toward his weapon. "Or that I've seen. Professionals. They're not making much noise, but they're searching in a pattern." Tommy stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "They'll reach this area by nightfall, maybe sooner, if they're better than I think." Gena felt her carefully constructed world continuing its collapse. "How long have you known they were coming?" 3 days. Since Dr. Vasquez's camp was hit. Tommy's gaze settled on her with the particular intensity of someone delivering uncomfortable truth. They would have come sooner, but I needed to understand their search pattern first, to know if they were hunting randomly or if they knew where to look. And Marcus stepped forward, all martial now. They know the general area, maybe a 5-mile radius, but they don't have a specific location yet. Tommy pulled a hand-drawn map from his jacket, spreading it on the small table beside Gena's laptop. These are their positions as of dawn. They're using traditional search patterns, which means they have training but not perfect intelligence. Elena leaned forward despite her exhaustion, studying the map with a researcher's focus. They're concentrating here along the eastern ridge. That's where I found the staging area. They must think we're still in that region. We? Tommy's eyebrow raised slightly. You've made alliances quickly, Dr. Vasquez. She has evidence that corroborates what Gena found, Marcus interjected. GPS, tracking data, photographs of trafficking operations, documentation of population disruptions. Combined with the tracker that Eagle dropped, we're looking at a full picture of Kozlov's new network. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between the three of them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful consideration. 3 years ago, you came to these mountains to hide, Gena. I understood that choice, respected it. But hiding and running are different things. Running means you're still being chased. Hiding means you've found a place to make a stand. This isn't about philosophy, Gena said, but her voice lacked conviction. Everything is about philosophy when you're deciding how to live. Tommy moved to the window, looking out at the forest he knew so intimately. My grandfather taught me that the eagle doesn't hide from the storm. It uses the storm's wind to fly higher. The question isn't whether danger is coming. Danger is always coming. The question is what you do when it arrives. Elena made a soft sound that might have been agreement or pain. Marcus simply watched, his expression carefully neutral. You're saying I should fight, Gena said flatly. I'm saying you already are. Tommy turned back to face her. The moment you examined that tracker instead of destroying it. The moment you called your marshal friend. The moment you let Dr. Vasquez into your sanctuary. These are not the actions of someone hiding. These are the actions of someone who remembers what she stands for. I stand for staying alive, Gena shot back, but the words felt hollow even as she said them. No, Tommy's voice was gentle but unyielding. You stand for protecting things that can't protect themselves. That's who you were before, and that's who you still are. The mountains didn't change that. They just gave you time to remember it on your own terms. The cabin fell silent again. Through the window, Gena could see the forest stretching endlessly in all directions, the wilderness that had been her refuge and her prison for 3 years. Somewhere out there, men were searching for her, and somewhere beyond that, birds were being captured and sold because she'd chosen safety over action. The tribal council has offered sanctuary, Tommy continued. Our lands, our protection. If you're willing to work with us, we can coordinate a response that respects both sovereignty and safety. Federal jurisdiction gets complicated on reservation land, which means we'd have leverage. Marcus finished, understanding immediately. Time to build a case without exposing Gena directly. And access to tracking data my people have been collecting independently, Tommy added. We've known about the trafficking for months. We've been documenting it, waiting for the right moment to act. Dr. Vasquez's evidence and Gena's expertise could be that moment. Elena straightened in her chair, wincing at her injuries, but unable to contain her scientific enthusiasm. If we pool our data, tribal observations, my field research, the GPS tracking information, we could map the entire operation. Identify every staging area, every transport route, every person involved. And paint a target on all of our backs, Gena said. The target's already there, Marcus replied quietly. The only question is whether you face it or run from it again. The decision hung in the air like smoke, shapeless but suffocating. Gena stared at the faces around her. Marcus with his marshal's pragmatism, Elena burning with idealistic determination, Tommy offering quiet strength rooted in generations of land stewardship, each of them asking her in their own way to become someone she'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Atlas pressed against her leg, his warmth a reminder that some bonds transcended fear. She'd adopted him because he understood trauma, understood the necessity of moving forward despite injury. Maybe he'd been trying to teach her that lesson all along. "If we do this," Gena began, then stopped. The conditional felt like cowardice. "When we do this, we need to understand what we're facing. This isn't just about stopping a trafficking operation. This is about going up against Viktor Kozlov, and he doesn't forgive or forget. Oh, which is why we need every advantage we can get," Marcus said. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through encrypted messages. "I've been building a file on Kozlov's activities since his release. Nothing concrete enough for an arrest, but patterns, shell companies, unusual financial transactions, known associates traveling to the Pacific Northwest. The problem is," his phone buzzed. Marcus glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted to something Gena couldn't quite read. Concern mixed with calculation. "What is it?" she asked. "Secure message. Someone wants to make contact." He showed her the screen, an encrypted communication request from an unknown sender routed through multiple servers. "They're claiming to have intelligence about Kozlov's current operation." Tommy moved closer, his eyes narrowing. "That's either the best luck we could hope for, or the worst trap imaginable." "Or both," Helena added quietly. Marcus's fingers hovered over the accept button. "Protocol says I should route this through official channels, run traces, establish identity before engaging. But whoever this is knew how to find my secure line, which means they have access to federal systems, or they're inside Kozlov's organization," Gena finished. Her stomach tightened with unwelcome possibility. "Accept it, but don't give them anything." The connection established with a soft chime. Text appeared on the screen, stark and urgent. "My name is Isabella Kozlov. I'm Victor's daughter, and I need your help to stop him." The cabin went absolutely still. Even Atlas seemed to hold his breath, as if sensing the gravity of what had just happened. "It's a trap," Marcus said immediately. "Has to be. Kozlov's daughter suddenly reaching out the moment we're investigating him. The timing alone." "Wait!" Gena leaned closer to the screen as more text appeared. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I've been feeding information to federal authorities for 18 months, since before my father's release. My handler can verify. Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Wildlife Trafficking Unit. I'm risking everything by making direct contact, but the operation he's planning is too big to stop through normal channels. He's coming to the Pacific Northwest personally. He knows you're in the region, Dr. Jenkins, the eagle with the tracker. That was him, bait to draw you out. And it worked." Elena's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh God, I led them straight to you. My research, the documentation—" "No," Tommy said firmly. "If this Isabella is telling the truth, they already knew Gena's general location. Your research just confirmed they were in the right area." Marcus was already typing rapidly, cross-referencing information. "Agent Sarah Chen exists. FBI Wildlife Trafficking Unit. She took over some of the cases from your original investigation, Gena. If this Isabella has been working with her—" He paused, pulling up another screen. "I'm sending a verification request through official channels. If Isabella Kozlov is a legitimate confidential informant, Chen will confirm." "And if she does?" Gena asked. "If this is real, Viktor Kozlov's own daughter turning against him, then we have a serious problem," Marcus replied. "Because that means everything we thought we knew about this situation just got exponentially more complicated." The phone buzzed again. More text from Isabella. "I don't expect you to trust me, but I can prove my value. The staging area Dr. Vasquez found? It's one of 7 in the region. The transport operation is scheduled for 3 days from now. My father will be there personally because he believes you'll try to stop it. He's using the birds as bait to draw you into an ambush. Everything, the tracker, the attacks on Dr. Vasquez, even the men searching the mountains right now, it's all designed to force your hand." "She's telling us we're walking into a trap," Elena said, "while also telling us how to avoid it. That's either incredibly helpful or the trap within the trap," Tommy finished. "Make us think we know the danger so we act predictably." Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, then at Gena. It's Agent Chen. That was fast. He put the call on speaker. Marshal Rivera, a woman's voice, professional and crisp. I understand you're making inquiries about one of my CIs. I need to know why before I confirm anything. We've received an unsolicited contact from someone claiming to be Isabella Kozlov, Marcus said carefully. Given the sensitivity of an ongoing investigation, I need to verify. Is Dr. Gena Jenkins with you? Chen interrupted. The question landed like a physical blow. Gena's eyes met Marcus's, both of them understanding immediately that this conversation had just entered dangerous territory. Why do you ask? Marcus's tone had gone completely neutral. Because if she is, you need to listen very carefully. Isabella Kozlov is legitimate. She's been my informant for 18 months, providing intelligence that's led to 17 arrests and the disruption of 3 major trafficking networks. But her position is incredibly precarious. Her father suspects she's the leak, and he's been using this Pacific Northwest operation as a test. If Isabella makes direct contact with any of you, it means the situation has escalated beyond what we can handle through normal channels. She already has, Gena said, speaking directly to the phone. She says Kozlov is planning an ambush, that he's using the trafficking operation to draw me out. Agent Chen was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made Gena's chest tighten. Isabella's assessment is correct. Victor Kozlov has spent 14 months planning this operation, and you're the primary target, Dr. Jenkins. The birds are secondary. He wants revenge, and he's built an entire criminal enterprise as the mechanism to get it. Then we shut it down, Elena said, her voice stronger than it had been since she'd arrived. We use Isabella's intelligence, coordinate with tribal authorities, and— You don't understand, Chen interrupted. Isabella isn't just risking her cover by contacting you. She's risking her life. Kozlov has already killed 2 people he suspected of betraying him in the past month. If he even suspects his daughter is working against him— The phone buzzed again. Isabella's text, he knows. My father knows I'm the informant. I have maybe 24 hours before he moves against me. But I can still help you stop the transport operation. I can give you locations, personnel, schedules, everything you need. All I ask is that when this is over, you help me disappear the way you did, Dr. Jenkins. I need witness protection. I need a chance to start over. Gena read the words twice, feeling the terrible symmetry of the situation. Victor Kozlov's daughter, asking for the same escape that Gena herself had chosen 3 years ago. Asking to trade everything, family, identity, life as she knew it, for the chance to do the right thing. She's serious, Gena said quietly. This isn't a game to her, or it's exactly a game, Marcus countered. The most sophisticated kind. Use his daughter to gain our trust, feed us intelligence that seems valuable but actually serves his purposes. Lead us into exactly the trap he's prepared. My grandfather used to say that the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in truth, Tommy added. But he also said that sometimes you have to trust the wolf who warns you about the bear, even knowing the wolf has its own reasons for helping. Elena stood, moving to the window despite the pain it clearly caused her. We're talking about this like we have a choice, but those birds don't have a choice. They're in cages right now, waiting to be shipped to collectors who'll keep them in captivity for the rest of their lives. Every hour we debate, more birds are being captured. More evidence is being destroyed. More distance Kozlov puts between himself and prosecution. She's right, Gena said. The words felt like stepping off a cliff, but also like finally planting her feet on solid ground. We don't have the luxury of perfect information. We never did. Even 3 years ago, when I testified, I didn't know for certain that it would be enough. I just knew it was necessary. Marcus rubbed his face, exhaustion and frustration evident in every line. If we do this, if we trust Isabella Kozlov's intelligence and move against this operation, we need to do it smart. That means coordination with federal authorities, with tribal law enforcement, with every resource we can muster. It means exposing your location, Gena, putting you in the system again. Are you prepared for that? Gena looked around the cabin that had been her sanctuary for 3 years, at the simple life she'd built, the peace she'd fought so hard to maintain. Then she looked at Atlas, at his steady amber eyes that had witnessed every moment of her isolation and never judged her for it. "I'm prepared," she said, "but on one condition. Isabella Kozlov gets her witness protection if she delivers. If she's really risking everything to stop her father, then she deserves the same chance I got. The same chance to build a new life." Agent Chen's voice came through the speaker, measured and professional. "I can arrange that, but you need to understand. Working with Isabella means you're no longer just a witness. You're an active participant in a federal operation. That changes the risk calculus considerably." "Everything changed the moment that Eagle dropped a tracker on my deck," Gena replied. "I was never going to be able to hide from this." "I see that now." Tommy nodded slowly, a gesture of respect and recognition. "Then we plan. We use every advantage: Isabella's intelligence, tribal sovereignty, your expertise, Dr. Vasquez's documentation. We make Kozlov's trap into our opportunity." 3 days, Elena said, still staring out the window. "We have 3 days to coordinate a response to an operation that Kozlov's been planning for 14 months. Those aren't good odds." "No," Gena agreed. "But they're the only odds we have." Marcus began typing on his phone, initiating protocols that would set federal machinery in motion. Isabella's messages continued to arrive, detailed information about personnel, equipment, schedules. Each piece of intelligence, another thread in what was either a lifeline or a noose. Atlas moved to Gena's side, pressing his warm bulk against her leg. She rested her hand on his head, drawing strength from his steady presence. 3 years ago, she'd chosen isolation because it seemed like the only way to survive. Now she was choosing engagement, not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. Because some responsibilities transcended personal safety. Because the woman who'd testified against Viktor Kozlov hadn't really died in that courtroom. She'd just been waiting in the mountains, gathering strength for the moment when the world would need her again. That moment had arrived, and this time she wouldn't face it alone. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of coordinated chaos. Marcus established a command center in Tommy's tribal council building. A modest structure 20 miles from Gena's cabin that offered both legitimate authority and the jurisdictional complications that would slow any federal overreach. Agent Chen arrived with a tactical team, her professionalism barely masking the tension of working an operation where the primary informant was the daughter of the target. Isabella's intelligence proved devastatingly accurate. 7 staging areas exactly where she'd indicated. Transport schedules down to the 15-minute window. Personnel files on Kozlov's security team. Former military contractors with backgrounds in private security and no qualms about violence. Gena found herself in the unfamiliar role of strategic advisor. Her expertise in raptor behavior and trafficking methodologies suddenly valued rather than buried. Elena worked beside her, correlating field data with Isabella's intelligence, building a comprehensive picture of an operation that dwarfed anything Kozlov had attempted before his imprisonment. 47 birds, Elena said, staring at the compiled data on the 3rd morning. Golden eagles, peregrine falcons, even 2 California condors. Some of these species are critically endangered. If they're transported out of the country, they won't be, Gena interrupted, though she had no guarantee she could make that promise. "We're going to stop this." Tommy entered the room carrying coffee and the kind of news that made everyone's shoulders tighten. "My scouts just reported. Kozlov's people are moving up the timeline. The transport is happening tonight, not tomorrow. They're converging on the primary staging area now." Marcus looked up from his tactical maps, his expression grim. "Isabella said we'd have until tomorrow." "Why would they?" He stopped, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. "They know. Somehow Kozlov figured out his daughter's been feeding us information." Agent Chen's phone buzzed. She read the message and her face went pale. "Isabella's gone dark. Her last transmission was 15 minutes ago. Just 2 words, he knows." The room fell silent. Gena felt ice spreading through her chest. Isabella Kozlov, who'd risked everything to stop her father, had just become the most endangered person in the Pacific Northwest. "We need to extract her," Chen said, already moving toward the door. "I have a team." "No time," Marcus interrupted. "If Kozlov knows she's the informant, he'll move immediately, either to eliminate her or use her as leverage. We have to assume the primary staging area is now a kill zone designed to take out anyone who shows up, including the birds," Elena said quietly. "If he thinks the operation is compromised, he might just destroy the evidence. Kill the birds rather than risk them being recovered." Tommy was studying the maps with the focus of someone reading terrain, like a language. The primary staging area is in Bear Canyon, 3 miles into tribal land. Rough terrain, limited access points. If Kozlov's people have established positions, it's a perfect ambush site, Marcus finished. "Which means going in directly would be suicide." "So we don't go in directly," Gena said. The plan was forming even as she spoke, built on 15 years of understanding how wildlife moved through landscape and 3 years of intimate knowledge of these particular mountains. We use what Kozlov doesn't know: the terrain, the birds themselves, and the fact that he's so focused on revenge that he's forgotten what he's actually trying to protect. Marcus looked at her with the particular wariness of someone who recognized the beginning of a very dangerous idea. "I'm listening." "Kozlov thinks we'll try to stop the transport or rescue the birds during loading. He's positioned his people to defend the staging area and the access routes. But he's thinking like a criminal, not like a biologist." Gena pulled up Elena's field maps, overlaying them with topographical data. "These species, golden eagles especially, they're territorial. They have established ranges, preferred hunting grounds, specific roosting sites. If we can reach the birds before Kozlov moves them, we release them," Elena breathed, understanding immediately. "We open the cages and let them fly. Kozlov loses his merchandise, we save the birds, and we don't have to engage his security team directly." "That's insane," Chen said. But her eyes were on the maps, calculating possibilities. "The staging area is surrounded by his people. You'd never get close enough to—" "I would," Tommy interrupted. "My family has used the passages through Bear Canyon for generations. There's a route Kozlov won't know about because it's not on any official maps. Narrow, difficult, but it comes up directly beneath the staging area's eastern edge. And once the birds are released..." Sir Marcus pressed. "You think Kozlov just lets you walk away? He's been planning this operation for 14 months. He'll have contingencies, backup positions, people stationed at every possible escape route." "Which is where federal law enforcement comes in," Gena replied. "You can't move on the staging area directly without triggering the ambush. But once we release the birds and Kozlov's people react, they'll expose their positions. That's when your tactical team moves, not to rescue us, but to contain and arrest." Agent Chen was nodding slowly, the tactical logic overriding her initial skepticism. "It could work. If, and this is a very large if, you can actually reach those cages without being detected. The moment Kozlov's security spots you, the entire plan collapses." "Then they can't spot us," Tommy said simply. "This is my land. I know every shadow, every sound the wind makes through the canyon. If Dr. Jenkins and I move carefully—" "I'm going too," Elena interjected. "You'll need someone who can work quickly with the cages. Some of these birds may be injured or stressed. Having 3 people means 3 targets instead of 2, Marcus said flatly. "This isn't a research expedition, Dr. Vasquez. If Kozlov's people catch you, they won't just destroy your equipment this time." Lena's jaw set with familiar determination. "Then they won't catch us." Atlas, who had been lying quietly near Gena's feet, lifted his head and whined softly. She reached down automatically, fingers finding the ridge of scar tissue behind his ear. He'd been with her through 3 years of isolation, had been her only constant companion through every moment of fear and doubt. Now he was reading her intention to walk into danger, and his amber eyes held a question she couldn't answer. "He stays here," Marcus said, following her gaze. "I know you're thinking of bringing him, but a dog in that terrain, with the need for absolute silence—" "I know," Gena said quietly. The words hurt more than she'd expected. "He stays, The planning took another 2 hours. Timing, equipment, communication protocols. Chen's tactical team would establish positions around the canyon's perimeter, ready to move the moment the situation developed. Marcus would coordinate from the command center, maintaining contact with all elements and prepared to call for additional federal support if needed. And Isabella Kozlov remained missing, her fate unknown, her final warning hanging over everything like a shadow. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Gena found herself back at her cabin for what might be the last time. She'd come to gather specific equipment, her old field gear, tools she hadn't touched in 3 years, but that her hands remembered with muscle memory. Atlas followed her from room to room, his agitation growing as he watched her prepare. Dogs understood intent better than words, and he knew she was leaving for something dangerous. "I need you to stay with Marcus," she said, kneeling to meet his eyes directly. "You understand? Stay. Protect." The commands were simple, but the emotion behind them was anything but. This dog had saved her sanity during the darkest period of her life, had given her a reason to keep going when isolation threatened to consume her entirely. Atlas pressed his head against her chest, and Gena wrapped her arms around him, allowing herself 30 seconds of vulnerability before the mission required her to be strong again. The hike to Bear Canyon took 3 hours, moving through terrain that would have been treacherous even in daylight. Tommy led with the confidence of someone who could navigate these paths blindfolded. Elena followed with surprising competence, her researcher's observational skills translating well to wilderness movement. And Gena brought up the rear, her senses hyper-alert to every sound, every shift in the wind that might indicate they'd been detected. They reached the eastern approach to the canyon, just as full darkness settled over the mountains. Below them, perhaps 200 yards down a steep slope, they could see the staging area. Portable lights powered by generators cast harsh illumination over a scene that made Gena's chest tighten with rage. Cages, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows. And in those cages, the distinctive silhouettes of raptors. Golden eagles with their massive wingspans compressed into spaces barely large enough for them to turn around. Smaller falcons pacing with the agitated movements of wild creatures in captivity. And in one cage near the center, the unmistakable profile of a California condor, one of the rarest birds in North America. "There," Tommy whispered, pointing to a cluster of figures near a large transport truck. "Kozlov's security team. I count 8, maybe 9. More than Isabella indicated," Elena murmured. "He's doubled the protection." Gena studied the layout with a scientist's eye and a tactician's necessity. The cages were locked with standard padlocks, nothing sophisticated, which made sense for a temporary holding facility. They could open them quickly with bolt cutters. But the spacing between security patrols was tight, maybe 90 seconds between passes. They'd need to move fast. Her radio crackled softly. Marcus's voice, barely audible. "Command to field team. We have a situation. Vehicle approaching your position from the north, unidentified. Could be additional security or..." The transmission cut off. In the canyon below, every security guard's radio buzzed simultaneously. Gena watched their body language shift from bored vigilance to active alert. Weapons appeared, safeties clicked off. The portable lights suddenly seemed brighter, more focused, sweeping the perimeter in organized patterns. "They know we're here," Elena breathed. But that wasn't quite right. The security team wasn't looking up the slopes where Gena's team was positioned. They were focused on the canyon's main entrance, weapons trained on an approaching vehicle that emerged into the light with deliberate slowness. A black SUV, expensive and out of place in this wilderness setting. It stopped 50 yards from the staging area, engine idling. The driver's door opened. Isabella Kozlov stepped out, her hands raised and visible. Even from this distance, Gena could see the blood on her face, the way she favored her right side as if injured. But she walked forward with her chin raised, moving toward her father's operation with the bearing of someone who'd made an impossible choice and wouldn't back down from it. "No," Agent Chen's voice crackled through the radio, sharp with horror. That's not Isabella. That's the woman in the light stopped, and Gena saw her face clearly for the first time. Not Isabella Kozlov. Someone else entirely, roughly the same build and coloring, but the features were wrong. A decoy or a trap within a trap. "Pull back," Marcus commanded through the radio. "This is wrong. Pull back now." The world exploded into chaos. The decoy woman dropped to the ground. The security team opened fire, not at her, but at predetermined positions around the canyon's perimeter, at locations where Chen's tactical team had established their positions. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like lightning, and the sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the canyon walls with deafening intensity. Kozlov had known, not just about Isabella's betrayal, but about the entire operation. He'd used his daughter's intelligence to feed them exactly the information that would draw them into this kill zone. And now, federal agents were pinned down under heavy fire, the element of surprise completely lost. "Move," Tommy hissed, already sliding down the slope toward the cages. "While they're focused on the perimeter. It's our only chance." Gena followed without thinking, her body moving on instinct while her mind struggled to process the catastrophic failure of their plan. Elena was right behind her, all three of them racing down the treacherous slope with the sounds of gunfire providing terrible cover. They reached the first row of cages just as someone shouted from across the staging area. A security guard, young and startled, bringing his weapon around. Tommy was faster, tackling him low and hard, the two men disappearing into the shadows between transport trucks. Gena pulled bolt cutters from her pack, hands shaking as she cut the first padlock. The golden eagle inside screamed, wings beating against the cage with panicked fury. She opened the door and ducked back, giving the bird space to escape. It burst from confinement with a cry that cut through even the gunfire, wings spreading wide as it climbed toward freedom. "Keep going," Elena gasped, already working on the next cage. "As many as we can." A bullet sparked off the cage beside Gena's head. She dropped flat, pulse hammering. More guards were converging on their position now, the element of surprise completely gone. They'd managed to free perhaps a dozen birds, but there were 30 more cages, and armed men were closing in from all directions. Tommy reappeared, breathing hard. "We need to go. Now this position is compromised." But Gena was staring at the center of the staging area, at the cage holding the California condor, one of fewer than 500 individuals left in the wild. If Kozlov's people killed it out of spite or destroyed it as evidence, an entire species would be pushed that much closer to extinction. "I'm not leaving that bird," she said, already moving. Tommy's warning was cut short as more gunfire erupted. Federal agents were pressing forward now, trying to create space for extraction. But the canyon had become a kill box, and they were all trapped inside it. She reached the condor's cage, just as a figure stepped from the shadows. Tall, gray-haired, moving with the confidence of someone who controlled every variable. Viktor Kozlov studied her with eyes that held 3 years of planning and patient hatred. "Dr. Jenkins," he said, his accent barely detectable after decades in America. "I've been waiting for this moment for a very long time." Time seemed to fracture. Gena stood frozen, bolt cutters still gripped in her hands, facing the man who'd occupied her nightmares for 3 years. Viktor Kozlov looked older than she. Remembered, the prison years had carved deeper lines into his face, but his eyes held the same cold calculation that had made her testimony feel like signing her own death warrant. "You're wondering where my daughter is," Kozlov said conversationally, as if they were discussing weather rather than standing in a war zone. Gunfire still echoed from the canyon perimeter, but he seemed utterly unconcerned. "Isabella is safe for now. Her fate depends entirely on what happens in the next few minutes." "You're using your own daughter as leverage." Gena's voice came out steadier than she felt. "That's low even for you. I'm teaching her about consequences." Kozlov gestured to the chaos around them. The freed birds circling overhead, the firefight between his security team and federal agents, the remaining cages full of terrified raptors. She thought she could betray family without cost. Now she understands differently. Tommy and Elena had taken cover behind a transport truck pinned down by crossfire. Marcus's voice crackled desperately through Gena's radio, demanding status updates she couldn't give. And somewhere in this nightmare, Isabella Kozlov was being held hostage by her own father. "Let the birds go," Gena said, forcing her scientific mind to override panic. "You've already lost this operation. Federal agents are here. Everything is documented. Whatever you do now just makes your sentence longer." Kozlov smiled, the expression holding no warmth whatsoever. "You still think like a scientist. Always analyzing, looking for rational solutions. But this was never about the birds, Dr. Jenkins. This entire operation, 14 months of planning, millions of dollars invested, it was always about this moment. About making you understand what you took from me. I took nothing. You broke the law. You exploited endangered species for profit. I just testified to the truth. You destroyed my life." The cold mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine rage underneath. "My reputation, my business, 3 years of my freedom. And you did it by hiding behind science and morality while knowing nothing about the real world, about what it takes to survive, to build something meaningful." A bullet sparked off metal somewhere close. One of Kozlov's security team shouted something in Russian. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Gena realized with terrible clarity that Kozlov didn't care. He'd built this entire operation as an elaborate suicide mission, content to burn everything down as long as he took her with him. "Your daughter doesn't deserve this," Gena tried. "Whatever Isabella did, she was trying to stop you from making things worse. That's not betrayal. That's love." Love. Kozlov tested the word like it was foreign. "My daughter loves the idea of redemption more than she loves her family. But she'll learn. We both will, in whatever time we have left." His hand moved toward his jacket. Gena recognized the motion, the particular way someone reached for a concealed weapon. Her body reacted before conscious thought, diving sideways as the first shot cracked past her ear. The condor's cage exploded in a shower of metal fragments, the massive bird inside screaming with primal terror. Gena hit the ground hard, pain lancing through her shoulder. But she was moving again immediately, scrambling toward the damaged cage. If the condor was injured, if Kozlov killed it just to prove a point, Tommy appeared from nowhere, tackling Kozlov with devastating precision. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs. Tommy's wilderness strength matched against Kozlov's cold efficiency. Elena was suddenly beside Gena, both of them working frantically to open the condor's mangled cage door. "It's hurt," Elena gasped, blood on her hands where sharp metal had cut her. "Wing damage. It can't fly," the condor hissed, beak snapping defensively. Gena could see the injury, a gash along the leading edge of its left wing, bleeding freely. Flying was impossible, but staying here meant certain death. "We carry it," Gena decided. "Get the emergency carrier from my pack." Around them, the battle reached a crescendo. Federal agents had broken through the security perimeter in 2 places, pushing Kozlov's people back. But the canyon remained a chaos of muzzle flashes and shouted commands, and they were still trapped in the center of it all. Tommy rolled away from Kozlov, breathing hard. The older man was down but not out, reaching again for his weapon. Tommy kicked it away, then froze as more figures emerged from the shadows. Kozlov's reinforcements arriving exactly when he'd planned. "It's over," Kozlov called out, his voice carrying despite the surrounding chaos. "I have 12 men in position. Federal agents are pinned down, and Dr. Jenkins is trapped with an injured bird she's too noble to abandon." The irony is almost poetic. Marcus's voice crackled through the radio, tight with desperation. "Gena, we're bringing in air support, but you need to hold your position for at least 10 minutes. Can you?" The transmission cut off as someone jammed their communications. Gena looked at Elena, at Tommy, at the injured condor they'd managed to secure in the carrier. 10 minutes might as well have been 10 hours. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this scene of human violence. The piercing cry of a golden eagle, impossibly close. Atlas's distinctive bark, sharp and commanding, coming from somewhere above them on the canyon rim. She looked up and saw silhouettes against the night sky. Marcus had released Atlas, and the German Shepherd had done what he'd been trained to do his entire life, track and locate his handler. But he hadn't come alone. The freed birds, dozens of raptors that should have scattered to the winds, were circling back, drawn by the distress calls of the birds still caged, driven by territorial instincts and the presence of the injured condor, whose cries signaled danger to the entire population. "Get down," Tommy breathed, understanding what was about to happen. The eagles dove, not at Gena or her team, at Kozlov's security forces, at the men with weapons and hostile intent who registered as threats in the birds' primal understanding of danger. 47 freed raptors, their survival instincts activated, their territorial aggression focused on the perceived predators below. Chaos became pandemonium. Grown men screamed as Talons raked faces. Weapons fired wildly into the air. The carefully coordinated security positions collapsed into panicked confusion as nature itself seemed to turn against them. "Move!" Tommy commanded, and they were running, Gena with the carrier, Elena providing cover, Tommy clearing their path. Atlas materialized beside them, his presence both impossible and perfect, guiding them toward an escape route that hadn't existed seconds before. Behind them, Viktor Kozlov's voice rose in furious disbelief as his perfect trap disintegrated into feathers and fury. His final words chased them into the darkness. "This isn't over, Dr. Jenkins. It will never be over." But for now, they were moving, away from the kill zone, toward federal positions, carrying the injured condor to safety. And above them, the freed birds soared against the night sky, wild and untamed, proof that some things refused to be caged, no matter how elaborate the prison. The veterinary clinic on the reservation operated out of a converted garage, but the equipment was first-rate, and the staff knew their work. Gena watched through the observation window as the veterinarian, a young woman named Dr. Sarah Redfeather, worked on the condor's damaged wing with steady hands. Atlas pressed against her leg, his warmth grounding her after the chaos of Bear Canyon. He'd disobeyed Marcus's command to stay, had somehow tracked her across 3 miles of wilderness and arrived at exactly the moment she'd needed him most. Some bonds transcended training. 43 stitches, Dr. Redfeather announced, emerging from the surgical suite 2 hours later. "The wing will heal, but it'll be months before we know if he can fly well enough for release. He'll need rehabilitation, monitoring, specialized care." "I'll do it," Gena said immediately. The words surprised her, but they felt right. "I have the expertise. I can set up a proper rehabilitation facility." Marcus appeared in the doorway, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. "Kozlov's in custody. 6 of his security team dead, the rest arrested. Isabella's safe. We found her locked in a storage container 2 miles from the staging area, dehydrated and traumatized, but alive." He paused. "She's asking for you." Gena found Isabella Kozlov in a small recovery room, an IV in her arm and bruises darkening her face. The young woman looked up with eyes that held too much knowledge for her age, the particular awareness that came from choosing principle over family and living with the consequences. "You saved my life," Isabella said quietly, "by stopping the operation. If you hadn't, if my father had succeeded, he would have killed me to eliminate the evidence of my betrayal." "You saved your own life," Gena corrected, "by making the choice to do what was right despite the cost. That takes courage. I'm not sure I could have managed at your age." "I'm 28. You were 29 when you testified against my father the first time." Isabella's smile was bitter. "We're not so different, you and I. Both of us chose to burn down our lives rather than stay silent." The parallel was uncomfortable and true. Gena sat in the chair beside the bed, feeling the weight of 3 years of isolation and the uncertain future that lay ahead. "Agent Chen says you'll get witness protection. A new identity, relocation, the whole package." "Like you did." Isabella's gaze was steady. "Except you chose to disappear on your own terms rather than accept the government's version. Was that the right choice?" Gena thought about her cabin in the mountains, the peace she'd found in solitude, the 3 years of safety purchased at the cost of purpose. "I don't know. It kept me alive. But I'm not sure surviving and living are the same thing. Tommy appeared in the doorway with Elena, both of them showing the strain of the past 24 hours, but standing upright nonetheless. The tribal council wants to offer you something, Tommy said to Gena, a partnership. We need someone to run a proper wildlife monitoring and rehabilitation center on reservation land. Someone with your expertise and experience. The position would be legitimate, public, protected by tribal sovereignty. You could do real work again, Elena added, her enthusiasm barely contained despite her exhaustion. Research, conservation, education. Everything you gave up 3 years ago. But on your own terms, in a place where Kozlov's reach is limited by jurisdictional complexity. Gena looked at each of them. Marcus with his protective concern, Tommy with his quiet wisdom, Elena with her passionate idealism, and Isabella with her hard-won understanding. A community, not the isolation she'd chosen, but something deeper and more sustainable. What about Atlas? She asked. And the condor? The other birds that were injured? They come with you, Tommy said simply. The whole package. Your dog, your rehabilitation cases, your mountain cabin, as a satellite station if you want it. We're not asking you to give up what you've built. We're asking you to expand it. Through the window, dawn was breaking over the mountains. The same peaks that had sheltered her isolation now offered something different, a chance to integrate her past expertise with her hard-won survival skills. To be both the scientist she'd been and the wilderness-tested woman she'd become. I need to think about it, Gena said, though she already knew her answer. Some choices required time to acknowledge, even when your heart had already decided. Atlas's tail thumped once against the floor, a vote of confidence from the one who'd walked beside her through everything. 6 months later, the Pacific Northwest Wildlife Rehabilitation Center thrived on tribal land. Gena stood watching the condor from Bear Canyon practice flight patterns in the massive recovery aviary, his healed wings strong and steady. Atlas dozed nearby, gray-muzzled but content. The research center hummed with activity, Elena training interns, Tommy teaching traditional ecological knowledge, volunteers preparing rehabilitation cases. Everything Gena had abandoned 3 years ago, rebuilt on her own terms. Victor Kozlov was serving 25 years. Isabella had disappeared into witness protection with gratitude and hope. 47 birds had been saved. Release day, Dr. Redfeather announced, opening the aviary door. The condor emerged slowly, wings spreading wide. He paused on the platform, dark eyes scanning open sky, then launched himself into freedom with powerful thrusts that sent dust swirling. Gena watched him climb and disappear into blue distance, feeling something fundamental shift inside her. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of purpose. Her greatest wounds had become her greatest contributions. Atlas pressed against her leg. Elena appeared at her shoulder. What are you thinking? That sometimes you must be caged before understanding freedom. And the bravest thing we do is help others find their wings while learning to use our own. Somewhere the condor soared wild and free. Somewhere new challenges waited. But here, now, Gena stood firm. Not hiding, not running, doing work she was meant for, surrounded by people who'd become family. That was the truest freedom of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Bedisis